Okay, and then you're going to let me know when I'm on?
Yes.
Yes. Dr. Deaton, if you want to give it 2 minutes and then go ahead and get started.
Okay, so we are on live at this point?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So hi, world.
We're going to be hello to everybody, and we'll be conspicuously silent for just a moment then. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and welcome everyone to this particular keynote address, a very exciting address, an exciting personality who will be talking with us today. Jocelyn Brown Hall, the director of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. We're here for the Within Reach, No Poverty conference, sponsored by the Deaton Institute of the University of Missouri. And we're so proud to have Jocelyn Brown Hall with us. The FAO division, the FAO organization worldwide has been very important for us, and our close relationship with the North American Liaison Office means a great deal to us, and we really appreciate this opportunity. Prior to serving in the liaison director's role, Jocelyn Brown Hall served as the deputy regional representative for the FAO Regional Office for Africa, where she oversaw 47 FAO country offices in Africa and guided their strategy and communications around food security. She also served as the FAO representative for Ghana, where she worked with ministries of agriculture, fisheries, social protection, and trade. In 2015, she was appointed as deputy administrator in the Foreign Agricultural Service, where she led USDA's $2 billion food and technical assistance program in low and middle income countries. In this position, she oversaw USDA's international food and technical assistance programs, including programs that university people are often very familiar with, the McGovern-Dole Food for Education, and the Child Nutrition Program, the Food for Progress Program, the Cochrane and Borlaug Fellowship Program, and numerous other technical assistance projects that promote US government food security and trade capacity building goals. She's worked worldwide in many capacities and brings a wealth of experience to her role with FAO. She actually began her career teaching English at an agricultural university in Peshawar, Pakistan, while serving in the Peace Corps. She then ran the largest income generation program for Afghan women refugees in Pakistan for Save the Children. Brown Hall holds a master's degree in business administration and international business and development from George Washington University and graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University with a bachelor's degree in American literature. We're so pleased to have you with us for this very exciting moment in the life of the world and in a very momentous time. So I will turn the program over now with great cheer to Jocelyn Brown Hall. Welcome to the conference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deaton. I really appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me today. Also, thank you to Holly for making this possible. This is a critical and timely discussion that we're having on Sustainable Development Goal number 1, zero poverty, and Sustainable Development Goal number 2, zero hunger. As you can hear, I do have an agricultural background, but I didn't go to a land-grant university, so I have kind of adopted some land-grant universities during my time at USDA. University of Missouri was certainly one of them where we did a lot of programs. So you'll forgive me for not being part of the land-grant university community, but maybe you can kind of let me in as a special member. So the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO, is a specialized technical agency under the United Nations, and it was formed in 1945 before the end of World War II to address food and agricultural issues, knowing that there were hundreds of millions of people in Europe at the time who were facing starvation. And United States and Canada, which are both part of my office, we cover them out of Washington, D.C., but we cover both the United States and Canada, have been at the beginning of FAO's history. And we greatly appreciate the leadership from the United States and Canada, not just the governments, but also from universities and thought leadership and academia in both countries. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm really excited to talk to students. I was saying earlier to Professor Deaton and Holly that I don't often get to talk to students, and so it's a rare time. I'll try to do less talking and more listening, and maybe you all can challenge me with some hard questions at the end after I do a little bit of discussion around FAO. So among the broad mandates of FAO, and which is basically ending zero hunger, we support farmers and food producers and their livelihoods to improve the resilience of food production systems. So you'll hear the term agri-food systems a lot in what I have to say today. And if you continue on in this space of international agri-food systems, it's a term that you'll get to know well. We are on the ground in FAO in over 130 countries. Professor Deaton mentioned I was the representative to Ghana. When COVID broke out, I was actually on a work trip to Zimbabwe and got stuck in the lockdown there. So I became the representative to Zimbabwe, the kingdoms of Eswatini and Lesotho when I was there, because the position was vacant and they needed someone to fill it in. So we are in 130 countries and we have decade-long interactions with them in some pretty hard places. So for example, we have an office in Ukraine right now. We have an office in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Yemen, South Sudan, Bangladesh, Democratic Republic of Congo, and others, but we are there to stay and deliver and make sure that not just ministries of agriculture, but related ministries, fisheries, livestock, women and youth, or gender, social protection, trade, commerce, all have support from us in the agriculture sector that covers the gamut of what agriculture means. And I know you as students probably understand how broad that region is. So we've made tremendous strides in 75 years in reducing hunger, but unfortunately, despite those efforts, we still have a ways to go. You may have heard of something called the State of Food Security and Nutrition Report, which comes out every year. The one for 2021 will come out this summer for 2022, and we are still off target. We have over 810 million people who are suffering from hunger these days, and it's due to 4 things. It used to be 3, but now it's 4. The first one is something that you probably have heard of well, climate change. Agriculture is both a contributor to and a casualty of climate change. Another one is conflict. There's more man-made or humankind conflict in the world now than there has been, just in terms of sheer numbers of people. We have more emergencies throughout the world, 10 emergencies throughout the world that you probably don't even hear about that much, but those are all hotspots. The third one, the third C, is really economic downturn due to COVID-19, this pandemic. I don't think anyone thought it would go on this long or it would have the great effect, and we're still feeling the effects of it right now. And the fourth C, which is actually related to the third one, is cost. Food prices are at an all-time high right now, and it's due to a lot of different factors, not the least of which is inflation going on, as well as we are seeing for the first time in all of our lifetimes, depending on how young or old you are, a conflict between 2 major agriculture producers, Ukraine and Russia. So as our global community faces conflict, it's important to recognize that there are solutions out there. And I think sometimes in agriculture, we get steeped in our problems and steeped in how worrisome it is and how complicated it is, and it is complicated, but there are solutions out there. And one of them that I want to highlight is a major success that FAO had with other UN agencies and ministries of agriculture. There was this little thing called the desert locust uptick in 2020 that you probably didn't hear very much about. And it was actually literally of biblical proportions in the Horn of Africa. These locusts came out because of climate change and warming trends, and they were all over Eastern Africa. And while COVID was going on, FAO joined up with 20 different ministries of agriculture, the private sector, Google, Garmin, you may know of them from the GPS people, other UN agencies, private sector pilots to use it's called biopesticides to eradicate desert locusts. So there are solutions out there. They're complicated. They require a lot of coordination. They require people, agencies working together and understanding what their lanes are, but it can be done. I want to talk a little bit about, dig a little deeper into food security and what Sustainable Development Goal number 2 does. We oftentimes think about hunger as just like feeling hungry, or food security is people don't have enough available food. The reality is there's 4 pillars to food insecurity. And if you know them, great. If you don't know them, now's the time to know. The first one is around availability of food. Is food grown in the country that you live in? So for example, here in the United States, we live in a place with a lot of different biomes and ecological systems. So we have a lot of different agricultural zones, as you know. Saudi Arabia, less so. Taiwan, not so much. Singapore, pretty much all concrete. Oh, excuse me. So we have different biospheres and ecosystems. And is food available? Can it be grown? The second one is around access. Can you purchase food? And this is really where a lot of people, certainly people in the United States, because we have abundance of food here, but this is where people who are low income, this is where they fall into food insecurity because they can't purchase it. The third one that's related to this is utilization, which is eating enough healthy and nutritious food. So you can eat enough calories and not have a healthy diet and therefore not be food insecure. And then the fourth pillar is around stabilization. Is your country at war? Are there shocks to the system? So these are the 4 pillars. And for example, we want to make sure that we have access to nutritious food, and that people, so when we work to make people more food secure, it's not just about producing more food. And a lot of times programs are focused on producing staple crops, but we want to make sure that they have access to healthy and safe food, and that they have the tools they need to interact in commerce in this food. So are there markets there? Are there processing facilities? A lot of the issues going on right now in Ukraine and Russia is not just that the farmers can't get to their fields, or the fields are being bombed, or they don't have access to seeds because the roads are closed. It's they don't have access to ports, so they don't have processing facilities. So, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when I get to the Food Systems Summit part of this. There's also a lot of waste of food. And I think this is something that if I could plant one seed with you all, because this is actually something that personally you can partake in. Globally, 1/3 of food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted. And 14% of the food is lost between the post-harvest stages until the retail level. And then over 930 million tons of food, or 17% of all ready to consume food, is thrown away. I had an opportunity last summer. I was up in a small town in Vermont, which is near where my family goes in the summertime. And they had an electrical storm. The storm due to climate change. And I went into a convenience store and they had emptied all of their freezers, and they were literally throwing away tons and tons of meat and poultry, that if only people could have come up and just picked that stuff up. And meat and poultry and dairy, those are the most intensive foods to create. And it's that kind of food loss and waste that is actually the second largest greenhouse gas emitter in the agricultural sector, is food loss and waste. So anytime you're throwing your food away in the garbage can, you're basically throwing it into a landfill, and then it goes into a landfill and creates methane, and that's the greenhouse gas emitter. So if I can do one plug for you today, please either eat your food or compost it. So, but it's a critical way. It's not just about greenhouse gas emissions, it's also about productivity. If we could create less food and produce less food, or produce it more efficiently, then actually farmers could, you know, be more profitable in their area. If there weren't an overabundance of food that was being thrown away, then actually agriculture could be a greater livelihood. I also want to talk a little bit about biodiversity, because as I mentioned, agriculture is both a contributor to and casualty of climate change. And today, the food systems account for more than 1/3 of global greenhouse gases. And I talked a little bit about the parts of that. One of them is food loss and waste, and the other one, major one, is unfortunately livestock emissions, although I think there's a lot of interesting things going on right now in that area, especially in the feed that's going into livestock. But I also want to talk about, you might not know that 70% of the freshwater withdrawals globally are being degraded, and that food utilizes 50% of the Earth's habitable land. If you are reading at all about Ukraine right now, you may have heard, it's a little bit esoteric, but you may have heard of a debate going on in the US Department of Agriculture about whether to pull out some of the 30 million acres of land they have in the Conservation Reserve Program to see if they should put it back into production for things like wheat, because of the situation in Ukraine and Russia. And those are fragile lands. And so the debate is whether do you use those lands to feed people, or do you use those lands to save the conservation? And I'm not saying one way or the other, I'm just saying it's a complicated issue. The same is true in the Amazon. I don't think Amazon, I have not met in 25 years of my time being in agriculture, a farmer who is interested in abusing his or her land. And I think that it's a myth that we need to debunk, that farmers are abusing their natural resources because they're evil or something like that. And I'm being a little facetious, but I think you get my point. So we're also lost biodiversity in our diet. We have over 6,000 plant species, and we account, and only 9 account for 66% of our diet, 9 out of 6,000. So we need to think about biodiversity as part of the climate change. And this is why FAO is part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Preservation, to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems. So transformation, what can we do? I know it feels overwhelming. I've talked a little bit about composting. If I could really encourage each one of you to compost, that would be great. But we need to think of this in a broader way. And I want to go back to something I brought up before, which is food systems. The UN Secretary General, the top of the UN, Antonio Guterres, convened a food system summit in 2021, where FAO played a major role. And for those of you who are not aware of food system, it really is a holistic approach to the entire system. Before, we talked about value chains and kind of seed to fork or farm to fork issues. Now this brings into other societal issues and other sectors, such as health and nutrition, transportation, which is a huge part of agriculture, and agriculture is heavily reliant on it. We're also bringing in things, labor issues. FAO does quite a bit of work on child labor and reducing child labor, especially in the hazardous areas in major commodities such as cotton, cattle, and cobalt. Cobalt isn't agricultural, but the other two are, and coffee and cocoa. So youth, we have a huge imbalance in the developed world versus the developing world, and in the youth populations involved in rural areas. I know that I'm talking to a lot of youth in semi-rural areas in the United States, but 70% of Africa is actually under the age of 30, and they need jobs. And just going to the cities and leaving lands behind that are not productive is pressurizes the agricultural systems. And the same is true in the United States. We need people to stay in the agricultural sector and find ways to make it more interesting. And I think with innovations, applications, technology, drones, robotics, all of these are areas that have huge applications in the agriculture sphere. I want to talk a little bit about community, what each one of you can do as well. Being part of the food pantry system, volunteering, 1 out of 9 people in the United States is hungry and is food insecure. So that's an important volunteer and advocacy role that actually doesn't take that much time. And we need to kind of redistribute the food that we have in the United States through those mechanisms. Advocacy. I'd be interested to know, I don't know if there's any agriculture communicators out there, but how many times you hear about agriculture in the media. I would say there's not that much, and oftentimes it's very negative. It's about the myth that I talked about earlier. Farmers are kind of contributing to greenhouse gases and they're not doing their part, or you shouldn't eat this, you shouldn't eat that. It's oftentimes very negative, and I would encourage all of us to advocate for agriculture sphere as a way of obviously feeding the world and preserving the planet. It can be done. There are systems to do it, but it doesn't get talked about enough. I had the pleasure, a little intimidating pleasure, but it was the pleasure of speaking to 3 women senators on Friday about women in Afghanistan and their agricultural sector. And the 3 women senators, there's only 13 women senators, so you've got a 3 in 13 chance of figuring out which 3 they were, but they were not aware that agriculture was such an important sector to Afghan women. And in fact, it's the only sector where Afghan women have a chance to empower themselves. So this is an advocacy for you to speak to your local governance, regional, to state level, and have your representatives and senators talk about it here in Washington. So I mentioned a little bit about innovation, and I want to challenge all of the students, particularly here, to think about agriculture as a very innovative way. A couple of things that I think would be important to note is that for old people like me with white hair, things like flaxseed and quinoa, and I'm trying to think of other avocados. These were not part of my daily diet when I was your age. These are all new not innovations, but new uses of food that can be brought to the table. And the diet in the United States in many places has changed dramatically. So there's diet changes, there's drones that help us collect data, there's digital phone applications. I don't know about you, but I use a couple of health and fitness apps to log my steps and calories and my macros. There's that kind of stuff. There's blockchain technology. And then there's things like drip irrigation, which have, essential for production going forward because of water conservation. So I know that there have been different hackathons or different technopaloozas in the agriculture sphere, and FAO is really committed to using these. One of the ones that I'm really interested in is if you go to any developing country, there are 2 things that I can assure you will be part of their agriculture challenges. One of them is access to finance, and the other one is land tenure, and those are related to each other because you need land to be able to get credit. Well, MasterCard has come out with a card that needs very little internet connectivity, so that farmers and producers can actually sell and buy from each other without very much internet connectivity, because very few people in the developing world are connected. And then when they do have to check in about every 10 to 14 days, but that gives a lot more flexibility. So there's all kinds of tools that are out there that can relieve the pressures of zero hunger and zero poverty. So I'm going to stop there. I've done way too much talking as it is, and I'm just looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and bring it on for challenges or ideas. I really get a lot of energy from talking to young people. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ms. Jocelyn Brown Hall. It's been a pleasure to have you as a guest today, and you made so many insightful comments and raised so many questions about hope for the future. I was intrigued by the way you've challenged us to think about young people going into the agricultural sector. And as you know, I have often said, it's one of the certainly the most fundamental scientific areas. And you've pointed to that and how relevant it is to climate change and so many other issues that we are dealing with today. But the drones and robotics that we're now using just brings it full scale. Anything further you want to elaborate on there would be?
Sure. I mean, I think, technology needs to be thought about in many different ways. I think in in our world, in our developed world, where everything is on our phone, we automatically go to an app or a drone. I mean, my understanding is there's actually kind of labs in the air right now. I haven't seen them myself, but they're, that are doing precision agriculture in the air of how much pesticide and how much herbicide and how much nutrition and fertilizer that is needed. There's that kind of stuff, but there's also really, on the ground technology and some things that, there's two systems that are related to each other that I learned about when I was in Ghana, because fisheries is a really important part to a lot of Africa. It's where people get protein. And there's a system whereby we help low-income people who live on the coast to actually do aquaculture farming through big vats, like tin drum vats in their backyards, and raising catfish or tilapia or equivalent, and being able to sell them, but then using the waste from those tin drums and actually then using that to fertilize, irrigate and fertilize their gardens so that they can have fresh produce. And then on top of that, we have a smoking machine that we have developed that reduces, in Africa, oftentimes your fish is smoked because there's not a lot of cold chain. So it's there to preserve the fish. And we've done something so we can reduce the smoking hours, something like 9 to 1 hour. So that reduces charcoal use, and it also improves the health of generally the women that are smoking the fish. So, it really, it can be anything and everything in these areas. And I think this generation needs to come up, those of you who are steeped in this technology and can see these uses really need to, I challenge you, because old people like me, we don't think like this. So we need the ideas, the fresh ideas.
Well, I endorse your ideas of your idea about needing fresh ideas, but I certainly wouldn't want to put you in the category of the old.
I know, I'm pretty.
You're the new leader here, so we're looking to you for direction and know that it will be there. Question has come in based on, again, your emphasis on communications and how really amazing it is today still to see so many people know so little about the fundamental industry that keeps us alive every day. And we had a questioner who made the comment that Secretary Vilsack always says we need a hit TV show focused on the work that USDA is doing. That seems consistent with what you have remarked also. One could also say what FAO and what the global effort to feed the hungry is.
If I could just state there, so USDA is one of the broadest ministries of agriculture in the world. Most ministries of agriculture are focused more on production. Agriculture kind of stopped there, whereas USDA includes the animal and plant health, inspection service, the food safety. It has the food entitlement programs in it. It has the Forest Service in it. It's just the statistics service, all those information services. So in a lot of countries, those are broken up. And I think USDA is actually, I worked there for 23 years, so I'm fond of it, obviously, but just bringing all those together is a really important aspect to it. And of course, trade. FAO is as broad as USDA plus fisheries. So if you think of all of USDA plus the Department of Commerce's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency stuck together in one big agency, plus a little bit of Bureau of Indian Affairs, plus a little bit of Health and Human Services and Nutrition, all of that is in the agriculture sphere. And it really shows the breadth of what you talked about, what feeds us every day. And yet we know so little about it. And not only do we know so little about it, but there's so many people who feel that because they eat food, they know something about agriculture. And so they go out there and say things about it that are just completely not true. So we have to really work at communicating in agriculture, and it's science. It's and yet it's a science about which people feel very passionately. So because food is culturally so important to us, and so we really have to make sure that we separate fact and fiction in the agriculture world.
Yeah, thank you. That's so true. Yes. Another question that's come in has to do with. Really, it's asking for maybe your thoughts further on the issue of concentration in the plants used in commercial agriculture. So concentration and diversity. And I don't recall the exact numbers, but you mentioned something like only 9 plants that are the predominant producers of food, I believe, for the human beings.
So, I mean, that has, evolved over time, and a lot of people, again, this monocropping gets a bad name in agriculture, and yet if you talk to ag economists, or if you talk to producers, they'll say, well, given the food system that we're in, monocropping is the fastest and the most productive way I can do something. But so you can't really fault the producer for trying to do something in the most profitable way possible, especially when the margins are so thin for farmers. So I think that we've learned over time about rotation. I think most good producers, do rotations of their crops and do, leave fields fallow, or, do ground cover of sorts. I think there's been a resurgence of sort of smaller agricultural farms where, people can do rotations of plants, and then, I'm actually not a farmer myself, so I can only do this by what I've been told. That they've done rotations and they've been able to make the best use of their farms, along with, there's agroforestry techniques where you can combine livestock with agroforestry. So there's a lot of different opportunities there. I think we have to be, as consumers, we have both a right to know what, there's a lot of consumer advocacy things going on right now, which that's the consumer's right, but there's also a responsibility on that side of understanding, how much things really do cost, and what's in a food. And I think oftentimes that second part gets lost a little bit, that the consumer has a responsibility to say, I understand that the true cost of food might be higher, and I might have to be expected to pay more. Mm-hmm. In the United States, we pay the lowest amount of our, on average, the lowest amount of our income on food than any other country in the world.
Yes, great.
So,
well, your comments about this communication issue has struck a number of our audience with a real interest, and I think your observation that the Ukraine conflict is, for the first time that I think in most of our memories, we have 2 major agricultural producers in conflict, creating havoc on many aspects of the world market. Do you think, the question has come in, do you think that negative agricultural opinions, or why is it that those negative opinions about agriculture, which we still struggle with the education of our youth, they overpower the positive agricultural advocacy that is out there?
If I had to answer that question, I would have fixed it by now, because it's been over 20 years that I felt that way. I think a lot of it has to do that, of the reduction of agriculture practices in the school systems. So for example, I grew up in an urban area, never had any training on agriculture, had to learn it all on my own. I think basics of agriculture should be taught in schools, and I have had the pleasure of sitting with some ag educators in middle school and high schools. I know that there's a program in Iowa. I sat with some teachers in the World Food Prize in Iowa in October. I don't know the program in Missouri. Maybe you can educate me on that. But kind of like financial literacy, you need agriculture literacy as well for people to understand. There's so much out there on what to cook, and there's so little out there on how our food is grown. Mm-hmm. And what that means, and who's affecting it. And the only things that are out there are things like, well, it's all corn and soybeans in the Midwest and there's nothing else, or there might be a little bit about something like citrus greening in Florida, maybe a little bit sometimes, but there's really not very much. And agriculture, unlike other sciences, there's a seasonality to it. There's, it's more at the mercy of weather patterns than any other science. So there's so much that goes into it. And I know I'm stating the obvious, but if you talk to your average person on the street, that would just be not something that you should know.
Yeah, we have our own program began to work with Extension and others to create a Missouri Youth Initiative, Youth Institute. It is an initiative to try to reach out more effectively. 4-H and FFA programs do this to some degree, linked with the universities, but it is a continuing struggle we have. We do have a program Friday, in fact, here as part of this extended program celebrating that issue.
I think that 4-H is important to continue on, and it's not just for the ag producing states. It should be really. I mean, right. I know it's in every state, but it's a wonderful program that right. I wish I had known more about when I was growing up. So.
Yeah. Well, a question has come in from the audience. Would you speak more to the development of orange flesh sweet potato in Africa and some programs like that that really illustrate, I think, the power of research and sticking with it for a while?
Sure. Yeah. So the other thing about agriculture is it's not short term. Your results. You might be able to put something in the ground if you're doing a staple crop and see something in 6 months. But boy, if you're trying to grow avocado trees, banana trees, anything like that, it's years. And unfortunately, humans, especially some humans in Washington, can have short-term memories about how long things take. And research in agriculture takes a long time. And we have new technologies, CRISPR, gene editing, that have shortened that time, but it still takes time. And orange flesh sweet potato is just the prime example. I have Jan Lowe, the person who won part of the World Food Prize Award for this, one of my favorite people, and one of my heroines. She took she realized that the sweet potato is widely eaten in Africa, and yet there are a lot of nutritional deficiencies. That pillar 3 that I was talking about, nutrition pillar, utilization pillar of food security, and she over time developed this orange flesh sweet potato to insert keratin. It was keratin into the sweet potato so that children wouldn't die of would have blindness or wouldn't have vitamin E deficiency. I think I've got that right. So there's all kinds of ways, and if I didn't, tell me. But there's all kinds of ways in which we can factor in. I mean, we've been doing this since the beginning of agriculture, factoring out the lesser or less desirable traits and factoring in the more desirable ones. And I think that's another area where we need fresh eyes and fresh ideas about how we start combining foods to address them, because many, many people, hundreds of millions, actually 3 billion people in this world do not have access to healthy and safe foods. And so we need to find ways in which, if they're going to get food, that it better be healthy and safe.
Thank you. Those are excellent comments. And Jan Lowe, I can recall when she won the World Food Prize, and was such an exciting moment, and represents, I think, the finest of what we try to cultivate in higher education and research, and work with the CGIAR system and other institutions around the world. Holly, other questions that you have come in?
Yeah, I can ask a few. Let's see here. Is there an interest in including agriculture in state standards? There are certainly similar movements for robotics and other computer sciences, but how can students apply such technology without insight into the user's needs, specifically state education standards? How you talked about everyone should be learning about agriculture, learn the basics of agriculture. Should that be a requirement?
Can you repeat the first part of the question again? Just to
yeah,
make sure
so there's some interest across the United States and different states of having agriculture included in state education standards, like some states have done with robotics or computer sciences. What do you think about agriculture being a part of that equation, and would you recommend that?
Well, I'm going to put a little bit, I am a UN employee, and we are very objective and neutral, so I can't tell any government what to do. But if, I think that more understanding of agriculture in-state, I think agricultural literacy is a critical part to feeding a world, having a world without hunger. mean, people just don't understand where it comes from, where it goes. There's very little understanding about fertilizers and pesticides. There's this notion that, farmers are just throwing toxic pesticides all over their lands that you can grow. Of course, there's been new trends of agriculture without any fertilizer and pesticides. I personally don't think we're quite there yet in terms of the seed input that we have and the land resources that we have, and the water. We're not quite there yet, but there's certainly trends in that area. So I think agricultural literacy is a really important part, especially to kind of counter the noise. There's a lot of noise out there on agriculture. I'll cite one article that I found particularly difficult, egregious, this is about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. The New York Times did an article where they compared the production in the United States of certain staple crops versus like maize, corn and soybeans versus that of Europe. And they concluded that the United States production was that the biotech seeds that the United States had used did not really increase or improve the productive capability from the United States to Europe. Those could not be two more different systems. Europe has 28 countries in it. The United States has 50 states. They're two different lands. They have two different, you can't make those kind of global comparisons. And the one thing, and yet it came out of the New York Times, which is a widely read, very well-renowned paper. And so I just think that this whole sphere needs greater literacy in it. And we're trying to do our part in FAO North America to get the word out about agriculture and agriculture systems, and that there is a place for agriculture, to be productive, to be profitable, and also to be sustainable, and not to degrade our environment any further.
Mm-hmm. Your discussion of the restrictions, or not really self-imposed restrictions on what we include, and this would apply to state standards kind of discussion that Holly just mentioned. I'm reflected back on, and early in my career, an article that made a profound impact on me was, I believe it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education, but it was by nutritionists, Andre and Jean Mayer. And the title of the article was Agriculture, the Island Empire. And they talked about you might say, the localization of agriculture within the land grant institutions, and lamenting the fact that many private universities, like Harvard, in fact, they specifically pointed that out, did not have any curriculum in agriculture. And they viewed that as just a real problem for our country as we go forward. Let me say, and so I share, that had a big impact coming out of my own background of 4-H and growing up in a rural area of Kentucky. What I've found since then, and it goes back to the question Ken Schneeberger raised about the orange flesh sweet potato, today, research to a great extent, agricultural research especially, is very much of a global enterprise, and the cooperation between the public and the private sector and the public and private universities is so profound. And it seems to me that, and I would just, I'm asking you, but as I offer an opinion too, is there not more work to be done to ensure effective collaboration and cooperation among public and private universities with the funding agencies and with the CGIAR, the consultative group, collaborative group on international agricultural research, and other international organizations in other countries? I know that's right in your domain.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yes, for the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research is a consortium of different international ag research centers. And if you ever get a chance in your lifetime to go to one of them, there's one on wheat in Mexico, and potatoes in Peru. There's one on rice in the Philippines. There's one on livestock in Nairobi. They're all just fascinating and really inspiring institutions. So I encourage anyone who has a chance to go see one. I really like the idea of the public-private partnerships in the ag research space. You know, in the United States, the predominant amount of ag research comes from the private sector, right? The public sector funding has been stagnant for several decades, I think. And I don't make any comment on that except to say that that's the system that we're in. I think that there has to be greater collaboration and cooperation in the private sector and the public sector in agriculture, both in the United States, and I see some happening. I think actually the United States is probably, in many ways, has a lot of examples that can be shown for the rest of the world, but in a lot of countries, including Zimbabwe, including Ghana, including countries where I've been in, the private sector is seen as kind of over there, and they're trying to make profit, and they're viewed as kind of not part of the solution. And you need investors in agriculture, you need the finance, you need new tech seeds, and none of this, you know, no farmer is trying to farm and produce for no profit. That's just the way it is. So we don't want a centralized agricultural system. So we have to come to a happy marriage here where, you know, we understand that the private sector is a critical part of research, of inputs, of seeds, of new technologies, of distributions, of packaging. If I could also encourage everyone in terms of a community thing that you could do is please stop using plastic. We have plastic everywhere, and it is really hurting the agricultural sector more so than any other specific sector. And you know, how can the private sector work with agriculturalists to create create packaging that is compostable, or that disintegrates quickly, or you know, those kinds of things. So the private sector is hugely important, and there's money to be made, and that's perfectly okay. In the agricultural sector, I think sometimes we think, oh, it should be done for free. Well, it can't be done for free unless you have a centralized agricultural economy, which we don't have. So, and which we've seen doesn't work. Isn't
it? And looking at that research balance, isn't it critical too to emphasize the basic kind of research, more basic research that's undertaken by universities, a public good component that is then drawn on by others and farther down the line of moving from research and knowledge to commercialization?
I totally agree. And I think that, you know, we are so blessed in the United States to have the land-grant university system that we have, the connections, the land-grant university system to USDA and the state and the county agencies, and that this is part of our, you know, we take it for granted. We take it for granted that there's these major universities that are going to devote, that have the resources and are supported through grants and, you know, state and national federal grants in this area, because most countries don't have it. And you go to a country like Afghanistan, where I've spent a fair amount of time before the recent events in August, and I worked directly with the Ministry of Agriculture, Irrigation and Livestock in the early 2010s, and we were trying to train agriculturalists. There wasn't anyone to be trained. There was no feeder system. There was nobody taking anything, taking any of these courses. So you know, just the vision of having the land-grant universities and having them connected to USDA and having that public research and having the space to, you know, research things that don't necessarily get to market. And well, you've learned something then about that it doesn't get to market, and so you got to try something else. It's just a hugely beneficial public good to U.S. consumers, an invisible public good. So.
Oh, thank you for that enthusiasm. So I hope we can keep working as partners in all of this.
One of my heroes, I mean, I don't know if you all know that Abraham Lincoln created the Department of Agriculture in 1862 during the Civil War, but one of my heroes is Justin Morrill, the senator from Vermont, who established, one of the senators to establish the land-grant university system.
Right.
So,
right. Yep. Exactly.
We all benefit from now.
Yeah. Early in your talk, you mentioned the locust outbreak in Southern Africa, or Eastern Africa.
Eastern Africa, yeah.
And I know you mentioned pesticide use to control it, but I was going to ask you about integrated pest management also. I know that's been a big thrust around the world and USAID supported work. The integrated pest management is still a very viable alternative and for looking at these issues.
Very much so. And I mentioned I was in Ghana. They have actually found a pest that is a predator to fall armyworm in Ghana. Their research center has, I believe it's within Land Grant University, but I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but I'll find out. And then also integrated using different plants actually to serve as a circumference around corn and wheat fields to combat fall armyworm, which is a huge issue in Africa. It has just taken over and it's literally eating its way through Africa. And this is just, with climate change and with global trade, which global trade, I'm a supporter of global trade. I think, no country can really be food self-sufficient without degrading the environment. You need to trade goods, but with that comes the risk of pest diseases and invasive species and things like that. And we just need better control systems, and integrated pest management is a critical part of that. And it doesn't have to be, it can be locally developed. And my understanding is that in Eastern Africa, they actually use a species of plant, as I said, to serve as a border around fields so that the fall armyworm, which doesn't like it, doesn't eat it. I think I'm right on that. It's been a couple of years since I worked on that, but it's those kinds of ideas sort of mixing in. And if I could just do a plug also for animal diseases, let's not forget that COVID-19, and 99% sure that it was an animal disease that moved to human diseases. 70% of our viruses come from animals in the human system. I don't know about you. I don't hear that too much in the news or on our parlance. We talk about human to human transmission. We don't talk about animal to human transmission. So again, just another area where, really saving lives can be part of, I hope I'm encouraging the audience of all the different opportunities in agriculture and the sphere that we're in.
Thank you so much, because those are so many very exciting ideas. And if you ever, as we talk to scientists who are doing work in this area, and they express the kind of enthusiasm that you project for this world of unknowns that we're living and working in right now. And so it's vital that our students capture some of that enthusiasm as well, because that is the only way.
Well, thank you. While I was in Ghana, actually, I mean, you probably didn't hear about those swarms, or if you did, you were one of the few people who heard about the desert locust swarms going on, because it got, the news got drowned out by other issues. In Ghana, while I was there, we have a One Health system. We work with Ghana to combine the Ministry of Agriculture, which includes livestock and veterinarian services, but also environmental services and human health. And we eradicated an anthrax outbreak in sheep while that was happening. And all of these things are happening under kind of the QT. It's getting handled so you don't hear about it, but that doesn't mean that there's not work going on. And, for someone who didn't get the honor of having an agricultural background, and I've had to learn all of this on my own, I'm really very much in awe of people who do this kind of work, and really encourage people who are interested in it, especially women, of course, in STEM, to pursue their dreams in this area, because there's so much to be done.
Well, thank you. And let me say, I kept up with it a bit because of a dear friend I have at Virginia Tech, Dr. Muniappan, Muni Muniappan, who's led the IPM project. And oh my goodness, it's just so exciting really to be in his presence and watch the kind of work he does with his students and colleagues around the world in some of the kind of Ghana, Africa, Nepal countries you've worked in. So it's an exciting area. Well, thank you, Holly. Any further questions at this point?
She's checking.
Yes.
Yes, there are questions in the Q&A box, Brady.
Okay.
So you should be able to see them. They're from Professor Willie Myers and from Summer LaRose.
Oh, if you could, I don't see those. I don't have. I'm not getting those.
Sure, I'll comment. There's a question about this is the first time since World War II that two major agriculture exporters are at war right now. It's two major exporters and producers at war, and how this may or may not impact the already dire food security situation. So, Russia, Ukraine combined are I think over 50% of the wheat and corn production, the oil seeds. So we in America don't import the wheat there, but their wheat goes to major hotspots around the world. So for example, I mentioned Afghanistan. Ukraine is a major supplier of wheat to Afghanistan, which is a wheat importing country. Yemen is another, Yemen and Syria, both wheat importing countries where wheat is a staple crop, heavily reliant on exports from Russia and Ukraine. And so with those cut off, that means that, it's just, strict supply and demand, it's strict economics. The prices are going to go through the roof unless some other demand some other supply that comes in. And we are in a situation where, agriculture doesn't grow overnight. And I know I'm stating the obvious, but it's just, you can't put wheat in the ground right now in the United States and have it feed people in the next 6 weeks. It's just not going to happen. So there are stocks, and there are, there are stocks enough right now, but we are very concerned about the harvest coming up in May in Ukraine. We're concerned that we're watching very closely as to whether or not there'll be farmers there who are able to do that, whether it's they're not risking their lives or whether they have access to their fields. And then we're also worried about plantings in June and July for the following fall. So it's really a ripple effect worldwide. It'll hit the Middle East and North Africa first, and Central Asia first, which is all wheat importing countries. But once supplies start getting gobbled up from the other sources, say United States or Canada or Australia, the major producers of these, then we're. So I don't think we certainly haven't seen the full ripple effect yet. And it's a very grim point. And I don't want to be too catastrophic about it, but it's something that the Food and Agriculture Organization, we are the ones that watch global supply and demand, and we've got economists watching it very closely and saying we've never seen things like this before. So let's hope that there are options out there, And as I said, wheat isn't grown in most countries. It needs a northern climate, and as many of you students know better than I do, there's a reason why you don't grow it in Saudi Arabia or in southern climes, things like that. I have a question about how can students and early career professionals interested in international development ensure that the work they enter supports communities, their long-term sustainability, and their cultural values. Where does our role end and local community leadership start? That's a really, really good question. I personally feel I've done a lot of work in sustainability in my lifetime through programs at USDA and now here in FAO. And I think, if the community is not willing to pick up the mantle, then for whatever reason, but I also think it's important to know what the root causes of why they might be not willing to pick up the mantle for something. And a lot of that can often do with things, just some basic things. I mentioned access to finance, which is just a problem throughout the world. It's a problem in our agricultural communities as well. And I think we have to come up with different finance schemes to allow it to make it easier for people to get into this space, because there is no risky. Agriculture is a pretty risky business, and yet it's such a fundamental business. In the US, the choice is to do crop insurance and those kinds of things, but that's not really available to your just average person all the time. So I think we really have to think as in a policy system, and this goes back to my point about advocacy of reaching out to policymakers. Do we have enough policy tools in our toolkit to make it to give communities opportunities to make changes where they are? Agriculture, are there enough tools in the toolkit for there to be community composting sites, for example. I talked about food loss and waste. Or is there enough pressure in the communities to have restaurants send their food to food banks or give it away at the end of the day? I can think of a few off the top of my head. There's some interesting things going on in Detroit. There's some interesting things going on in Oregon, but they're all really kind of fragmented. And I encourage the generation of students who, this generation who, can want to have their voices heard to make those kinds of points. But of course, if a community can't maintain it, then, I think you have to stop there. So hopefully that was helpful. Let's see, and there was one about state standards, and I think I've answered the question about standards. So
yes, and wonderful comments, suggestions you've made. We appreciate very much the generous spirit with which you have entered this discussion, and really appreciate your openness and your honesty and assessing and recognizing your role with the UN system and giving good advice, though, to the public-private sector leaders in this country, and particularly your advice to students. We are trying here to ensure that students find a way to gain that experience in problem solving, working with each other across disciplines in small groups. That's been the stamp of our Deaton Scholars Program that we're celebrating this week. And you have really added important dimensions to that, and we are deeply appreciative of it.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And I will give you and Holly my contact information. I love to talk to students. I'll talk to any and every student. I may not get back to you in 24 hours, but I'll try. And we do have a few internship opportunities coming up in our office here in Washington. They're not a lot. It's not a big office, but if you're interested in policy, if you like to write, we have some internship opportunities. So I would welcome, there's one coming up on communications, and there's going to be another one on legislation issues, legislative affairs. So I would love to have someone from Deaton Institute join our leagues here and represent the great state of Missouri or represent agricultural heartland. So that would be great. Yeah.
Well, that's a generous invitation. So we do thank you so much. And again, we appreciate you being with us and with your bringing your expertise and vast experience to bear on this very important keynote address and setting the stage for what we will do for the rest of the week. Jocelyn Brown Hall, thank you so much. We look forward to staying in touch with you.
If we have time, I actually have a quick question.
Whenever we can work that out as well.
Okay, Holly, did you have a question?
I do. So one thing that we had talked about, the morning panel that we had just finished, was with different leaders and executives at some leading nonprofits and non-governmental organizations. And one of the thoughts that they brought up was kind of the importance of partnering well and how different partnerships can really extend the work that we're all trying to do to alleviate hunger and poverty. I'm curious, Brady alluded to this with the Deaton Scholars Program and how students are working on community development projects of different sorts. What are some from your experiences, not just in FAO, but all of your career? Could you tell us some hallmarks of really, really great partnerships or really great on the ground interventions? And then on the flip side, some lessons learned from projects that haven't been as successful?
Sure. In the partnerships field, what I think is really important is when you get the right players together in their lanes. So I'll go back to the desert locust one. FAO was kind of the convener, but we had private sector pilots flying pesticide planes. We had local communities, local elders allowing access. We had ministries of agriculture saying, okay, yes, this is the target. We had Garmin in there saying, helping us with a GPS to detect where the desert locust. We had Penn State University with an application. Sorry, it wasn't University of Missouri, but we did have the Land Grant University engaged. And we actually had a couple of other UN, we borrowed some planes from the World Food Program. So I think that kind of partnership where every organization stays in its lane and brings to bear its strength, and doesn't try to kind of empire build. But I think many partnerships are either there's an unspoken thought that one of the two players wants money from the other player or wants to get into the other player's space. I think those are when they start to fall apart, and they're not very, they're not well thought out, where there's, an imbalance of either the terms of reference aren't clear. I've seen a lot of, or there's been promises made. I think that's the biggest one I've seen, where there's been promises made. And then, I mean, that's true of any project. I don't feel like I'm being very specific on that, but it's so hard to make sure organizations stay with their comparative advantage. I mean, we know, for example, in FAO, if there's an emergency out there where you need tents and shelter, that's not us. We're not those people. What we are is we're the people that, if there's going to be a crisis for a long period of time, such as Afghanistan, such as possibly Ukraine, we're the people to give some seeds and some livestock and some fertilizer and some tools to people so that they can grow their food locally. And that's our lane. So I think that's the key to it. And unfortunately, there's mission creep and bad actors, and and you have to stay on the mission that who you're trying to help, not trying to promote your own organization, which is hard. It's very hard to do. So I hope that answered your question. Unfortunately, I've seen more bad partnerships than I've seen good ones.
Yes, so. It looks like we had one question that kind of came as a result of my question, and then we'll end it after this one. This question is from Tien at Christopher Newport University, one of our university partners this week.
In the great state of Virginia, which is next to where I am, yes.
And she asked, how could leadership facilitate our efforts to eliminate poverty?
Ooh, how can leadership facilitate the efforts? Well, I think, first of all, this is true for any major cause, but it has to have an owner to it. FAO is the owner of a number of sustainable development goals. You have to have a champion for it. And that champion has to be real, be authentic about that. I have found in my career, and I'm not saying that I'm that high level of a leader, but I think also something that has worked for me, and I think I've had successful teams, is seeing people's strengths and allowing junior people earlier in their careers, giving them some space to do kind of cool and innovative things, and allowing them to try and to fail. Because we don't learn from our successes necessarily, we learn more from our failures. And that's the hard truth. It's painful, but it's the truth. You learn more about what is it, Albert Einstein? No, it was Edison who said, you'd make 10,000 mistakes before you finally get to the last, something like that, where, he had done 10,000 experiments before he got to the one that, worked. So you need to learn how to fail, and leaders need to allow people the space to fail. And that, I think, is very un-American culture. We're told to succeed and not to fail. And if I try to impart that with my own staff. It's okay. And leaders need to take the heat for it and stand up for their staff when things don't go that well, because we learn from failure, not success. So now you're getting me on a very philosophical note here on my management style. So anyway.
Well, a follow-up question to the earlier one that Dr. Tien asked about how much research that you're familiar with has been done about the role of leadership and poverty reduction, as far as you're aware, and then how necessary is the research, do you feel, on that issue?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head how much work is done in poverty reduction. There's been a lot of studies on leadership done. I have a theory, and I would be interested to know if those of you who have higher degrees in agriculture agree with me, but I have a theory that to be really good in agriculture, where it's heavily based in science, that to advance in agriculture, that you you're rewarded for things like precision, for objectivity, for digging deep into a certain issue, for really knowing that issue well, that those kinds of skill sets are not necessarily, they don't transfer well over to managing large issues, because the large issues such as poverty reduction or addressing hunger are not just multidisciplinary, but they require making decisions without a lot of information, which is sort of counterintuitive to people who have worked in science, because they want to make their decisions based on data and science, and that's how they've been trained. And so I found that, that agriculture in general, both at USDA and the FAO level, that people, there can be a risk aversity at times when people need to actually take leaps and take risks, that there can be well, I'm not sure that this will work. And, when you're facing feeding people, or you're facing significant poverty or significant crises, sometimes you got to just take some risks. And if there's one thing I could do to people working in agriculture is, you need to, your technology, your data, you have to be steeped in data, but you also have to be willing to take some risks. And that's where I think I've had to push. I've managed a lot of scientists in my lifetime, and I've had to push them the hardest in this, like, it's okay if you take a risk. So, and then of course, leaders need to be willing to support their staff. So it's hard managing scientists sometimes, and sometimes they think I'm very difficult to work for, because I'm always pushing them to make some hard choices with imperfect information.
So just to follow up briefly, the style and the incentives being used to manage those involved in the poverty alleviation effort would be very important issues of leadership.
Right. And people who generally are in this field, I mean, most people in this field are in it for the idealistic reasons. I mean, that's just the way it is. And so giving people the ability to see the results of their work, giving young people the chance to present what they're talking about, giving them the space to work on that. I know a lot of the positive feedback that I've received is that, if you allow for young people to have the space to create, or say, that sounds like a really wild idea, but I'm going to support you on it. Those are sometimes where the areas of the best creation come. And I find that a top-down approach doesn't always work well in this sphere, that it's really more, you have to listen to the people on the ground working on things. So, yeah.
Good point.
I don't want you to feel as if I'm going on and on. So I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I welcome anybody anytime. I love talking to universities and students, and maybe we're starting to open up. I did my first trip in my position to New York City for 24 hours, but hopefully I will get to the heartland and be able to see some of you in person. I really appreciate that. I'm trying to do I've challenged myself to do a 50-state tour, and then to do a tour of all the provinces of Canada as well. So, because I think if I'm going to represent the United States and Canada, I need to know what I'm talking about, even more so than what I've known so far. So hopefully I'll get to the great state of Missouri, get to see you. Yeah. And I always welcome you to the wonderful Washington, D.C. as well. So.
Well, thank you so much. You've been very generous, and I think we've come to a lull here in the Q&A. Holly, unless you have something further, we will go ahead and thank you so much. Conclude the session with great appreciation for the words and the spirit that you brought to the dialogue. And you've demonstrated some wonderful attributes that I think everyone will take away and use in their own management style as well. So, and
I'd love to hear from everyone, because I love learning from young people. So thank you so much.
Okay, well, that's an open invitation to all the people out there, as well as the internships. A great set of comments.
Would love to
have. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And we'll give you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.